Hello everyone, my name is Agata Kleczkowska. I am an assistant professor at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences and the Resilient Future Fellow. Listen to this podcast.
Welcome to the Visegrad Insight podcast.
We bring you global experts on the future of democracy, security, and economy.
The leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Hosted by editors of Visegrad Insight.
Powered by Respublika Foundation from Warsaw, Poland. It's Tuesday, 3rd of March 2026. I'm sitting in the office of Visegrad Insight, Respublika Foundation. My name is Wojciech Przybylski, and I'm joined online from Toruń, also Poland, Agata Kleczkowska, professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and our new Resilience Future Fellow. Welcome, Agata.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation, for having me here.
And we're so glad to have you and a cohort of new Resilient Future Fellows with us. Soon we'll be meeting, all of us, a new cohort of fellows at Visegrad Insight in Warsaw, people coming from Ukraine and Baltic states and Poland to collaborate and share experiences and build up resilience in our countries and in Europe. But before we do that, we record this podcast on the pressing events and pressing issues related to democratic security and resilience, in fact, that resonate across Central Eastern Europe. One of those events was the withdrawal of Poland from the Ottawa Convention. And the convention itself is about the proliferation, or it regulated and prohibited the proliferation of landmines. Poland is now considering to put landmines on the eastern borders, like a number of Baltic countries. My first question to you, Agata, what was your feeling outside of your professional expertise as a legal scholar? How did you feel when you heard the news that we're withdrawing from the Convention against landmines?
Well, my first thought was that times changes, and also the security needs of states changes. And in the current security environment, I think it is very important to provide some flexibility of choice to potentially use other weapons that we were not considering to this point. Of course, I really hope that also in line with the statements of the Polish government that the role of the landmine will be mostly deterrent, that it will be only defensive, not offensive use, that it is one of the means of showing our enemies, our adversaries, that we are able to deploy any measures necessary to defend our territory and freedom. Of course, on the one hand, there is such a clause in the Ottawa Convention which enables the withdrawal of states exactly for that purpose, that because international law must accommodate changing threat perceptions. But on the other hand, of course, Ottawa Convention right now, I think it has 161 parties, was very much successful in leading to a virtual halt in the global production of anti-personnel mines. And of course, this withdrawal of Poland, but not only of Poland, because I think of all Russian European neighbors, only Norway remained a party to the convention. And so, of course, the more states withdraw from such regime as the convention, the more the protection such a convention offers will gradually lower. So, of course, like in all cases, we need to balance some security concerns with the proper protection of civilians, most vulnerable ones. And I guess it's always a very difficult choice.
I think the changes also are in line with the technical capabilities that the current producers offer, that at least on paper, and they say in demonstration, shows the ability for those anti-personnel mines to be switching off after a certain period of time and not becoming a threat, as they have in the past been a threat to the local population after the conflict has been resolved. But the pressing issue here, as you rightly said, I think, is also a posture, a defense posture that needs to demonstrate resolve and clarity of action from the government of Poland, governments of Baltic states against the potential aggressor that is Russia today. One other question, before we go deeper into the question of democratic resilience, there is another no less important and in many ways fundamental for international law question, that is nuclear non-proliferation. As the bombs fell on Tehran, we heard the leaders of France, President Emmanuel Macron, among others, saying that nuclear proliferation in Europe might be taking place with the French armament. And France is considering to expand the what you would say the relocation of some and production and increase of the production of some of the nuclear weapons across other European partners. Poland is the country in Central Eastern Europe that is also being considered, and we have heard a number of politicians in Poland saying that this could be the case. Are we bound by international laws that would prevent us to do so? Are we, what are the legal boundaries Poland needs to be mindful of? What would you say in the context?
First of all, Poland is a party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So under Article 2, Poland must not manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons. So it all depends on how this sharing would look like, because the safest from I think the safest from the standpoint of international law option would be if France would spread over Poland some kind of nuclear umbrella. So the weapons would still remain in possession of France. The command and control would stay in Paris, and but there will be option to use it in case of an attack. And of course, it will also work as a very, I think, powerful deterrent against Russia and other adversaries.
But would you say that should France be given such a possibility by the Polish government, be invited, in fact, by the Polish government to locate part of its nuclear arsenal in Poland, would that be, at first sight, without a deeper dive into the legal analysis, would that be in breach of the treaty on non-proliferation, or that would be somewhere along the lines, and Poland could say this is exactly a clause, a caveat that enables us not to be in breach of the treaty, but to acquire, as you say, the umbrella, part of the nuclear umbrella.
I'm no expert in nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons, but according to my knowledge, if the weapons remain in French possession and Poland only agreed to their deployment on Polish territory, it would not cause Poland to violate the treaty on the non-proliferation. But I guess it's also a matter of deeper doctrinal discussions on this, and I guess that there will be many voices in the discussion once we will take such a decision.
And these 2 points, these are developments of the last week and this week, they all come in the context of a larger discussion of how to provide a credible defense posture. An element of that is also societal and democratic resilience. Now, I wanted to turn your attention, our listeners' attention, to this very concept that still remains, in my opinion, somehow vague, but might be my ignorance or our general public debate ignorance on the subject. Council of Europe uses sometimes the term democratic security, but how grounded democratic resilience is in the legal perspective, in your opinion?
First of all, maybe let's try to say what democratic resilience is from the legal perspective, because as you said, sometimes for the general audience, this is not a very much used term. And also I have a feeling that there's even not a proper word to very accurately translate the term resilient into Polish. So, from a legal perspective, in general, resilience from a legal perspective may be defined as the ability of the legal system to adapt to disruptions or disturbances. And when we add democracy to this layer, we can speak about, I think, three pillars of democratic resilience. So, firstly, resilience means that legal norms important for democracy, such as human rights norms, including political participation, freedom of expression, judicial guarantees, remain stable and not easily eroded during crises. Secondly, crucial for democratic resilience are institutions such as independent court, monitoring bodies, accountability mechanisms that can function even under political and security pressure. And thirdly, resilience in emergency situations is a real test for democracy. These emergency situations can involve a broad range of different crises, starting from the misuse of law through legal reforms or reinterpretation of constitutional provisions that instrumentalize law against democratic principles. But also it may be armed conflicts, other major security threats, pandemics. And this test is passed only if all measures adopted in such emergency situations remain lawful, proportionate, temporary, and subject to review. So, in other words, a resilient democracy is one where constitutional processes continue to operate, courts remain functional, elections remain legally regulated, and legal remedies remain available, even in the moments of serious crises for state. And when it comes particularly to my area of research, public international law, it also plays a role in the democratic resilience of individual states as it provides an external framework of commitments that reinforce the domestic constitutional order. It creates standards, accountability, ideally cooperation, sometimes pressure, that help democratic systems remain anchored in the rule of law.
You just mentioned, and I think this is the heart of the problem we're facing today. Again, in the week when U.S. president declared bombing Iran, essentially at his own personal decision, Minister of War or Minister of Defense, as State Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, Mr. Hexet said that the decisions about the course of action is dictated by America First policy and Donald Trump interpretation of what he is believing is the best for the America First principles or ideology. And that leaves us in a completely new chapter of the world system, I would say. I see you're nodding, so you will follow up, I'm sure, with a deeper understanding, because I'm saying that this is important for exactly the notions of resilience, especially important for the smaller states, many of them in Central Eastern Europe. I know you referred to those which are also external, dependent more on external. They are external to European Union. They're more individual, and yet they seek some sort of stability in the international order. How much of this debate will become, you feel, under your skin and in your expertise? How much of a urgency this debate will have in the context of action taken on the ground in Iran, in the Middle East right now? How seriously we are in deep trouble?
I would say that unfortunately, we are witnessing the erosion of the international legal system. So, on one hand,
Agata, I'm just sorry, I will interrupt you and I'll ask, are you sure we're talking about erosion or disruption? Is it a process or aren't we shaken up by what just happened? I'm injecting this question immediately because I'm sure every listener will have that in. And if you could clarify, do you think it's a more of a linear and process, or things that happened just shook the world that we know as it was?
I'm sure it shook the world as we know, and not only the intervention in Iran. This is one of the series of events that can lead to such a conclusion. I would say that it is erosion. It is not a total destruction yet, but unfortunately, I would say that it is somewhere on the horizon that we are slowly getting to this point, because international law has always, to some extent, operated in conditions of instability. There were always armed conflicts, geopolitical shifts, economic crises, and somehow, despite all violations of international law, at the end of the day, states have always come back over and over again to international law. So in the case of international law, I would say that this resilience to armed interventions, violations of international law, has always been almost a defining feature of the legal system. But today, I believe that the situation is different. And that's why I'm talking about the erosion, because in 2018, I defended my PhD thesis, and it was on the prohibition of the use of force. And in my thesis, and I analyzed over 30 cases of the use of force by states after 1945. And in the overwhelming majority of these cases, states violated the prohibition of the use of force. But despite that, my conclusion in my dissertation was that even though armed interventions undertaken under 1945 in theory violated the prohibition of the use of force, they actually still contributed to strengthening the prohibition of the use of force, as intervening states sought to justify their actions as consistent with international law without questioning the prohibition's validity. Furthermore, out of 193 existing states, this is the number of the UN members, only a few have undertaken armed interventions, and the rest of the international community largely opposed these violations of international law of the prohibition of the use of force, because they were clearly aware that failure to object to these violations could lead to the emergence of a customary law which would broadly permit the use of force. And now let's contrast this picture with exemplary reactions of states to the intervention in Iran that you mentioned started over the weekend. Israel justified the intervention by the preemptive self-defense, which is highly controversial legal ground, but at least they referred to international law. They tried to validate their action by reference to international law. I checked recently, and to this moment, I have not found any justification made by the United States of the legal grounds of the intervention in Iran. And to best of my knowledge, the only European state which clearly condemned the Israeli and US intervention in Iran was Spain, with the rest of the state focused only on condemning the Iranian military response. And of course, I understand why states are cautious about criticizing the United States. But it is not the first time in the recent months that the USA has bluntly violated international law and violated the prohibition of the use of force. And for the sake of the maintaining political alliances, the world is not protesting. This is how international rule of law dies, in silence. But I would also say that this is a moment of erosion, not a complete destruction, because, as I said, still there are some members of the international community which are referring to international law, which know that there is the prohibition of the use of force which needs to be observed, that this cannot be instrumentalized, that it cannot be omitted in the very political debate. But nevertheless, this is absolutely a very bad sign of where the international rule of law is heading.
Hi, if you're enjoying this episode, why not subscribe to Visegrad Insight? This gives you access to all our latest content online, as well as to our live and online events. You can use our special promo code for Visegrad Insight podcast listeners to get 35% off. Just go to visegradinsight.eu, choose a yearly subscription, and apply code Visegrad35. And now, back to the podcast.
Yeah, Stephen Krasner once wrote a book about sovereign states and the system of sovereign states, calling it the organized hypocrisy. Organized hypocrisy that corresponds to what you just said, as the states, despite violating the international order, they also aspire to uphold the values or the principles of the order, to maintain a safety net, essentially, against the potential aggression that would jeopardize their ambitions and their aims, their security. Now, that is going to be a closely observed space, and thanks for a bit of bigger perspective on these violations of the international law, how it is a never-ending story, but perhaps also you could shed some light on how not just state actors, but any international organizations may play a part in bringing the shattered world order into a state of cohesiveness, perhaps. I don't know how to call it, a state of balance, or if not, to try to bring it back under the same roof. It seems to me that the system of international institutions is even in greater jeopardy as the world today goes into this single state decisions on military intervention and interpretations of what's feasible, what's possible, and what is not. So are we going to see a survival, revival, or are we seeing a complete failure and collapse of the institutions that are founded, and they are international institutions in the world order?
Well, the international world order after 1945 was based on the United Nations, and the international peace and security was based on the role and responsibility of the United Nations Security Council. And 5 states were given this special role, being permanent members of the UN Security Council, which was supposed to come also with great responsibility. And as we know, this way of thinking failed very much. So today, when it comes to the United Nations, I think the best we can expect is a resolution coming from the United Nations General Assembly, condemning, commenting, addressing the intervention in Iran. But of course, United Nations General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. So it will not impose any obligations on states to undertake some specific measures, stop the intervention, stop the violation of the prohibition of the use of force. It may only recommend to do so. And of course, it is a very valuable political voice, because the UN General Assembly can be called the biggest political assembly in the world, but still it is non-binding. And even if it was, we need to bear in mind that international law is not a domestic legal system. It is built very differently from domestic legal systems, because in domestic legal system, when for instance, someone breaches a penal code and commits an offense, the police will start the investigation. It will build up the case, pass it on to the prosecutor's office. Prosecutor will submit an indictment to court. The court will review the case and decide on the guilt or not. It will convict the accused eventually and impose some imprisonment, fine, any other measure. And this is not how international law works, though, because there's no central enforcement organ. Even if we believed in the proper functioning of the United Nations Security Council, it was never supposed to be a central enforcement organ, central executive organ, a world government. There's no world police force that could identify the violation of international law committed by a state. There's no world prosecutor office that could bring an indictment. And finally, no court with the universal jurisdiction that could, in each and every case of violation of international law committed by a state, punish such a state. Of course, there are some international institutions, like I said, the United Nations Security Council within the UN system. There is International Criminal Court, but participation in these institutions and consequently being subject to their accountability mechanisms is voluntarily. States have to consent in one or other way to be brought before example gratia the International Court of Justice within the UN system. And even if states consent and the court rules that they breach international law and have to make example gratia full reparation for the injury caused, there is no worthwhile bailiff or some kind of repossession man to enforce such a payment. So when a state violates international law, states mostly have to take things into their own hands, and they can react with retortions, with countermeasures, so unilateral measures of self-help. But be honest, this is not very effective. So in these terms, I would say that this is one of the biggest challenges for the international legal system, that finding a balance between ensuring responsibility for violations in international law and respecting state sovereignty in the world where international institutions are failing, like the UN.
Yeah, well, speaking of UN and international law, gives us a very important context, because I think you generally argue that there are certain constraints, but also the sources of democratic resilience that are grounded on international institution, international law, that enable domestic resilience, domestic democratic resilience, democratic security to continue. Such cases are important when there are periods of attempts, let's say, of autocratic grab, of state capture in a number of Central Eastern European countries, and therefore, this moment also begs the question: are we going to see an autocratic moment resurfacing after a period of what seemed to be in Central Europe a moment of democratic relief, democratic revival to some extent, at least the promise of which that came with the Polish elections 2023. But in the year 2026, we're seeing elections in Hungary, where Mr. Orban might be looking at the international order, and it seems like he's already hinting at it, saying there might be international disruption that will prevent the fully orderly electoral moment in Hungary. Maybe indicating he might not honor the electoral process in Hungary on the grounds of state of exception he's been using most often, and also because of a situation in the international order. There might be questions about how elections are coming about in Poland next year. I know that's far-fetched. That's really long perspective from today's spring 2026, as we are planning to have general elections in Poland in the autumn 2027. But I think the question is still valid. To what extent the international turbulence and, as you say, erosion of the international system, international legal norms, may impact the democratic resilience at home and our domestic fabric of our democracies?
Well, absolutely. I would say that violations of international law and some either armed conflicts, economic coercion, and so on, they absolutely affect democratic stability and democratic resilience at the national level. Of course, and it can affect democratic resilience in several interconnected ways. Because first of all, different emergency situations can lead states to adopt emergency legislations or restrictions on certain rights. And if this emergency is prolonged, it can strain institutional balance and weaken oversight mechanism. So external illegality can indirectly place pressure on the internal constitutional order. Next, the legitimacy of domestic rule of law structures is influenced by the broader international legal environment. If international legal norms, including the prohibition of the use of force, are repeatedly violated without any meaningful accountability, this weakens the perceived authority of the legal norms more generally. And last but not least, armed conflicts and different coercive measures often have spillover effects, including refugee flows, national security concerns, disinformation campaigns. And in such cases, democratic resilience depends on maintaining the balance between the security and the protection of rights. I don't know if it answers your question.
I don't know either. I guess the reality on the ground will, in time, we will be monitoring and looking at the outcomes of the elections, not just as the results, but the processes that must be grounded and hopefully will be grounded in the norms accepted and adopted by democracies on the ground in Central Eastern Europe. But now, thank you so much, Agata, for the time and for sharing your comments. Do follow Agata in her work that we will also feature at Visegrad Insight and in her own capacity at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Agata, what topics are you working on most recently that we should shed some light on? Or what sort of publication you've been recently promoting, so to say, so to give food for thought?
Actually, just yesterday, my article was accepted for International Affairs. It is a journal which is published by Chatham House, and it is an article on the so-called use ad vim, so the limited use of force. So it is covered by any precise drone strikes, targeted killings, and so on. And I'm discussing whether this kind of operations really don't lead to the escalation and are less escalatory than full-scale conflicts from the perspective of international law and from the perspective of legal of opportunities that states which are targeted with such operations may undertake in line with international law. But I'm also preparing a book on retortions in international law, which I think is the most common response to any non-conventional threats. Maybe a little effective, but still the most common response states use to react to hybrid threats. So stay tuned.
Yeah, we'll definitely stay tuned and we'll follow through with the topics of your publications. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise on today's podcast episode. And stay with us for further episodes when we will feature other members of the Resilience Future Fellowship program, like Agata, fantastic minds, activists, doers and thinkers from Central Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much.
And that's all from this week's episode of the Visegrad Insight podcast, bringing you the leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Make sure to subscribe, and we'll be in touch next week.